A group of islands in the South Atlantic Ocean is in the spotlight. They are called the Malvinas by the Argentinians, but the Falklands by the British. A historical dispute over its status culminated in a war in 1982. April the 2nd, 40 years ago, was when the war started. And 40 years on, the dust seems yet to settle, with the UK and Argentina both claiming the territories. What's at stake today on these islands for the two countries? Today, let's look at this issue. I'm pleased to be joined by Professor Alessandro Teixeira at the School of Public Policy and Management at Tsinghua University in Beijing, whose grandfather was born in Argentina, as I understand, and Thomas Pauken II, author of US versus China, From Trade Wars to Reciprocal Deal, and Asia-Pacific Affairs and Geopolitical Commentator. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. So Saturday marked 40 years of the start of the war, which lasted days or a couple of weeks, but the situation is yet to be resolved. Argentina recognized the islands as theirs, but the UK calls them British overseas territories. Let me go to Professor Teixeira first to help us understand the Argentinian position.
Yeah, basically this issue has more than 100 years history. Okay, and Argentina is basically position is related to United Nations decision in 1958 about the Continental Shelf Convention. That means that the islands are facing Argentina, number one. So territorially and geographically belongs to Argentina. Number two, in the independence of Argentina in 1816, Spain was the colonial country in the region, gave to Argentina the territory ownership of that island. The problem that UK since that time opened a public dispute saying that was a naval base and belongs to what they call UK family island. That I'm completely opposed that. That's a UK, the British nation is a great nation. They don't need to think anymore in colonial times. You know, that's an action from colonial times.
Okay.
So basically, Argentina has the ownership from the independence and also from United Nations Convention.
Okay, that's your perspective. Mr. Pauken, what do you understand is the UK rationale or the rationale behind the UK claim?
Well, obviously, I did take a closer look at it, and I think the UK does have a valid argument. In 1982, when war was declared by Argentina, a few weeks later, they lost the war, okay? You have to deal with that. Is Argentina started a conflict, and the British ended it, and the Argentinians had to surrender. If they were insistent on winning that battle, perhaps they could have won, but they did not. So facts are what the facts are. And also what I also think about is the issue of disputing whether or not countries or Commonwealth have islands and faraway lands, whether or not that should be allowed. Well, it is. US has quite a few islands in faraway lands. So the thing is UK won the battle, they won the war, and it just is what it is. I mean, the Argentinians can be very upset about it, but they lost.
Professor Teixeira, what is your response to that? The fact, and it is recognized that Argentinian military did lose the war, and there was even a referendum, whether you like it or not, or whether some people believe that was a legitimate one or not, and the great majority of the people on the territory chose to side with the UK.
Yes, of course. This is what Professor expressed. Oh, we won the war and that's it, is exactly the colonial mentality that we need to fight against the 21st century. Okay, was based in 18th century when the British Empire was expanding and explore all the colonies all over the world. We can see Africa nowadays, we can see some cases in Asia, but the British Empire never arrived in the area of the Americas, as you see, the North America, but in the South America was Portuguese and Spain. But all this talk, Shin, is about colonial way of thinking. We are in the 21st century. This doesn't make any difference from the British Empire because is over. Okay, so UK doesn't need the island. The island is not even explored. And of course, you mentioned we had a referendum. And of course, the time of the referendum, Argentina economy and Argentina economic situation was very bad. So it's normal the people to say, okay, I prefer to be part of UK, has a stronger economy. But the point here is that we have a United Nations Convention, we have the Hague Court, we have all the international conventions saying that this belongs to Argentina, not to UK. And always the international community wants to settle this in a diplomatic negotiations that UK government refuses.
Okay, Professor Teixeira, I think we have to be extremely careful with these UN documents. I haven't seen, maybe it's because of my lack of research, I haven't seen UN documents which, specifically says these islands belong to any specific country. But the UN says you should resolve these through peaceful consultation. That point is really there.
Yeah, 1958. United Convention of Continental Shelf says that when you have a shelf of islands facing a continent, it belongs to proximity.
Okay, that's a general principle, kind of. Okay, but I'm going to give the opportunity to Mr. Pauken to react to what Professor Teixeira just said.
Yeah, definitely. First of all, it's also dangerous to make territorial claims. This is what starts wars. This could start even wars when you have territorial claims. Basically, Argentina sent their army and military in 1982 to the islands of Falklands. The UK responded. If they didn't think Falklands was important enough, they would have never sent their military, their navy. They would have never risked the lives of British citizens. Obviously, they thought it was very important, willing to fight over this island. So I think this idea that this, and also, as I said, in regards to British colonialism, territorial disputes, you're dealing with a highly sensitive topic, okay? Of course, countries will have disputes, but then suddenly you send your military into a territory that another government claims to have sovereignty over. I mean, this is very dangerous actions. And I'm not British, I'm American, but I can understand why the British responded the way they did.
So what can we say that because the way the world is today is the way it is, so we have to just accept it, and whatever legacy, even from colonialism, even with injustice, where people used a ruler to draw borders, we should just accept that and live with it? Professor Pauken?
Well, I mean, obviously it's not as simple as it seems, but you have very complicated issues. And when it comes to territorial claims and borders, a lot of countries are almost willing to go to war over those territorial claims and borders. We saw that in 1982. So, of course, the diplomatic approach is always the best approach, but you're going to have situations where territorial disputes do happen. And the best you can do first is try diplomatically. But when you send in military and then you just say, this is my territory, when another sovereign government already declared it, that's crossing the line. That's when you're going to start a battle.
I think this is a never-ending discussion, because if you're going to say I'm right, you're right, you say this, I say that. Sure. So how to resolve it is the real big issue. And are we seeing any potential here? Because there are clearly UN resolutions which calls on both sides to use diplomatic means to resolve this issue. And we have the Argentinian foreign minister publishing an article recently calling for improving bilateral ties with Britain. He says UK pretending that the dispute does not exist or that it does not create obstacles in our bilateral relationship is naive. Maybe, this may sound offensive to some people, but he seems to be reaching out. Professor Teixeira, is that the way how you see it? What does Argentina want to do? Do they want to resolve this?
They want to resolve in a diplomatic way, explaining the historical situation, as I said. Okay, so that's the right way to move forward. But the UK government, until now, insists to don't sit at the table to negotiate. So that's a kind of a difficult situation. It's a paradox. Argentina and I'm not discussing why went to war, why didn't went to war. This is the different perception of leadership by that time. But the current government wants to sit and discuss in diplomatic ways, because this situation is perceived by Argentina as an important issue in international relations, and especially in bilateral relations UK. So I think UK at least could have the courtesy, diplomatic courtesy, to sit and discuss the situation, because as even Professor just mentioned, this was drawn during the imperial times, during the colonial times. We live in a different world. We live in a world that needs more peace than war.
Professor Pauken, your reaction? Do you think to sit at the table and talk with the Argentinians at this moment is a gesture for peace or a gesture of potential more confrontational antagonism?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I always think about geopolitical strategy when talking to people. It's nice to have this concept or an idea of both sides sitting at a table discussing this specific issue of territorial claims. But unfortunately, it opens up a Pandora's box, because once the British go into negotiations, from the perspective of London and the people of the British, they may see that as a sign of weakness, as an opportunity for Argentina to take advantage of them and just basically steal the land from them. So what ends up happening, I think the better approach from a geostrategic level is to discuss how to improve Buenos Aires and London ties from that perspective. And then if they happen to address the Falkland Islands, what you're probably going to have is both sides taking a very stubborn stand. So I think instead just focus on how to improve Argentina-UK ties rather than focus on the concept of the Falkland Islands.
Professor Teixeira, do you agree with that approach?
Well, improving the relations is always a good approach, but it's always going to be the question of why, if you want to have a better relation, why we don't start a discussion. Okay, I don't see eye to eye to Tom in the sense that you believe that sitting is going to be a weak act. I don't see that way. Okay, I see in a different way.
I have to raise the issue here because China has made statements here, and the UK immediately turn around and say China must respect the Falklands sovereignty. It seems that the word must is in pretty much fashion, in big fashion these days. Professor Pauken, in all fairness, how do you look at this?
Well, I would be careful about the idea of must. I'm glad you pointed that out, because must sounds almost like a demand. In diplomatic, if I was to just sort of say, I'd probably use more voluntary type verbs, should consider, think about, because territorial claims are a very sensitive topic among countries that are having relations with each other. Sometimes they are willing to fight over those territorial claims. And I don't want to see an eruption of violence erupt over Falklands now. I happen to have heard that there were some very protests in Argentina recently, and they look very shocking to me, because they look like they wanted to go fight. I don't like to see that. This issue is not going to be resolved. A lot of times the territorial issues are constant, almost a permanent complaint. But facts are facts. In 1982, Argentina tried to take over the Falklands. They lost.
All right.
And,
sometimes
Professor, you just have to live with it.
Professor Teixeira, I give you 10 seconds to respond.
I think this is clear a double standard of UK, right? If we analyze their position in different locations in the world, not just to talk about Hong Kong, you'll see the double standards.
All right.
Okay? So this is what I don't like in this discussion.
We have to leave it there. It's a very tricky issue indeed, very, very complicated. And we'll talk about the Chinese position next time. It's also very hard to understand, I would say, for some people. But many thanks to Mr. Pauken II, Asia-Pacific Affairs and Geopolitical Commentator, and Professor Alessandro Teixeira, Distinguished Professor at the University of Tsinghua. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, Shanghai is closed off as COVID-19 cases soar. What's the situation on the ground, and where's the future? Stay with us.